This is Michael Clara coming to you from Salt Lake City, Utah with update number 13 to the Spencer Cox signature list cover-up. In this presentation, I want to go over the 11 people charged for forging signatures on candidate petitions this last election cycle. And I also want to go over these quote-unquote flagged signature packets for the Cox petitions and what happened to them. Before we go on, let me give Eternal Saints from X a shout out for the artwork that I'll use in this presentation. Let's start off with an interview of Lieutenant Governor Henderson in this show called Inside Utah Politics that occurred last month.
Well, today on Inside Utah Politics, a sit-down with the Lieutenant Governor. Our state's top elections officer weighs in on the final draft of mail-in reform and the scandal over primary signature gathering. Okay, let me switch topics in our last just quick 2 minutes we have. This week we saw some charges filed against those who gathered signatures. These were people going around allegedly forging signatures on packets for candidates to get on the ballot. One of them was for your campaign, the signature firm that you hired. Meanwhile, we had this audit back in September that looked at valid signatures and determined that it was likely that both your campaign and others got the required signatures. But how can you assure voters that none of the valid signatures that were counted in that audit were these potentially fraudulent ones?
Well, the reason that they were flagged is because the county clerks who were verifying those signatures saw anomalies. So those
But the audit, though, we were looking at the validated signatures, right, that had already been counted. That's the piece that's not totally connecting for me.
Well, and that's something I don't know the answer to.
Okay.
I'll have to look at that. But voters should know that if people cheat, and that's what happens, right? These people apparently got greedy, wanted to get as many signatures as possible because they were being paid by the signature, and were doing things that they shouldn't have been doing, and they got caught. This is not the first time that has happened. I do hope it's the last time that people try to cheat. It probably won't be, but that's the process working, right? They got caught. These were not candidates who were out there trying to cheat. These were people, contractors who were hired by companies the candidates paid to get these signatures. And I think that the candidates are the victims in all of this. I'm glad these people got caught. There's no room for cheating of any kind in elections.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Lieutenant Governor Deidre Henderson, thank you so much for coming on today and answering.
All right, so that's rather a bizarre interview because, especially because the Lieutenant Governor can't even answer a simple question. And I think that's just a byproduct of her inability to keep up with her own lies in this whole saga. But some of the highlights she tells us is that candidates are the victims in all of this and that these people got greedy. I'm glad they got caught, she tells us. But voters should know that if people cheat, that's what happens, right? These are not candidates out there trying to cheat. And I like this statement. There is no room for cheating of any kind in an election. I agree with that. But let's go over the things that I believe she's cheated on. So going back to these flagged packets, that in the audit from October, the Legislative Auditor General tells us earlier this year, when reviewing petition packets, the Davis County Clerk's office flagged some packets for having many non-matching signatures. They submitted those packets to the Lieutenant Governor's office for further review and then potential submission to the Office of the Attorney General for review. So when I read this, one of the things that I was interested in tracking down is they submitted those packets to the LG's office for further review and then potential submission to the Office of the Attorney General. So what happened to the ones that were not submitted to the Attorney General? What did the Lieutenant Governor's office do with them? Because at first I thought, well, they're not even recorded, and we don't have any documentation of them, but I think we do, and I'll show you how that works out. So they also tell us here that these are all the signature, the numbers that Cox turned in, the submitted signatures. The numbers in this figure do not include signatures and packets that were submitted to the Office of the Attorney General for further review. The Davis County Clerk's office completely removed those packets and signatures from the count of submitted and reviewed signatures for each candidate, which I've maintained that's illegal to do. So here's what I was able to determine based on grandma responses or based on records I received in response to grandma requests. Upon completing the initial verification process, the Davis County Clerk determined that the Cox campaign had not obtained the required 28,000 valid signatures to meet the legal threshold for the primary ballot qualification. This discovery represented a critical moment in the verification process and would typically result in the campaign failing to qualify for ballot placement, or they just end up having to turn in more signatures, right? The identification of this shortfall triggered subsequent actions that necessitated yet another deviation from standard electoral procedures and now raises more questions about the integrity of the signature verification process. So basically what happened was that after the shortfall was identified, the lieutenant governor decided to return flag signature packets to the Davis County, back to the Davis County Clerk. Some of these previously excluded flag signature packets were physically transferred back to the Davis County Clerk for supplemental processing. The Davis County Clerk then proceeded to process these flag signature packets, entering signatures into the statewide VISA system. Signatures from these return packets were marked as valid and added to the previous total to meet the legal threshold. So that's why I believe that you end up with a number of these incorrectly validated signatures ended up counting towards Governor Cox and allowing him to meet the threshold. But I went over this in the last update where nobody could agree on how many spare signatures there were. And this is why. Because they're shuffling packets back and forth. They couldn't even keep up with what they were doing. And so let me just, look at this in the context of time, that last June, in 2024, the media was covering the fact that Phil Lyman was calling for an audit. He was questioning the signatures for Spencer Cox. Natalie Clausen was in high gear, getting ready for an appeal with the State Records Committee in order to obtain the Ibsen signature list in order to compare it to the Cox list. And we ended up at the State Records Committee on July 18th. So, but before that time, going back to June, I want to go over this letter real quick just to give you a backdrop here, is that you have, in the midst of all this questioning, you have this assurance from the elections director. And he tells the candidate, Natalie Clausen, that signature packets for each candidate are reviewed independently of each other. Each signature is individually reviewed to ensure it matches the signature in the voter's registration record. The office of the lieutenant governor contracts with Davis County to verify the signatures for statewide candidates, thus removing any conflict with the lieutenant governor overseeing the review of her own campaign's signatures. Okay, that ends up not being true. And understand that at the time that he tells the candidate this, he knows that's not true. So going back down here, he says that the signature review stops once the required signature threshold is met. And he tells us his narrative that just was ad nauseum, kept being repeated all last summer and fall. The Cox-Henderson campaign submitted 592 additional signatures that were not verified once the required 28,000 signature threshold was met on March 18th. So we know that's not true, and they've admitted that to me in response to Grandma, that there are no 592, that it was just a rough estimate on his part. But listen here, look at this, the rest of this narrative. Had more signatures been needed, the campaign had an extra month to supplement its signature submission to secure a place in the primary election. So we know that there was no spare signatures. Well, first of all, we know that he didn't meet the threshold. And then their line was, well, but he had spare signatures. He actually didn't. We already talked about that at the last update. And now let's look at this 28 days. I put this on X yesterday that in January on social media, and I'm not involved. I wasn't, and I'm not involved in the Lyman campaign. So I wasn't following what they were doing. I had to go back and look it up. And, on social media, he's collecting signatures. And it looks like Cox's people thinks he's collecting signatures because it's not till March 30th that he officially says, I'm not collecting signatures. So I think that's what all the desperation was on the Cox campaign's part, is that instead of going out and getting more signatures when they knew they were short, they decided to go pull signatures from these quote unquote flagged fraudulent packets. That they're the ones that made the determination that they weren't going to include them in the Cox signature list, and now they're going back to rummage through them to see if they can get signatures out of it. And so here is what they're trying to avoid. Here's the Senate race. John Curtis, because he was probably the third or fourth person, maybe the third, to turn in signatures, a number of his are canceled out as candidate duplicates because I think the Walton campaign and the Wilson campaign had already turned in signatures. And so I believe that's what Cox's campaign was trying to avoid. All right, let's move on to these 11 people that were charged. We get a lot of detail in the media about their charges. Now, I want to point something out here, that back in November, I had already identified who the possible people that were submitting fraudulent signatures on the Cox list. And I even did a grammar request for the cover sheets for their packets. And again, this is just me looking at the Cox list and surmising that maybe these would be the ones that had questionable signatures in. And the reason was more about the numbers, not because I couldn't see the signatures or see if they were fraudulent, but I could tell by the number of signatures that were being turned in per packet that there was something wrong. And that's why I did a request for those. And you see here initially, my request is denied. They're not going to give them to me. And they even tell me that, that you could get all this information from the list. You don't even need these. And you know what? If you do want them, it's going to cost you $590. Well, I ended up appealing that, and we overcame that, and I was able to get some of the packet cover sheets, as you'll see. So what I'm going to talk about, and if you're new to this, I just want to point out that there's a cover sheet that a packet typically has 5 signature sheets, 5 of these in it, and then it has a cover sheet, and then the last sheet is called a verification sheet, and it looks like this over here, up here on the top, and then it gets turned in by gathering ink to the Davis County Clerk, and then it turns into this spreadsheet that we see here. And I just want to remind you that this is what the Cox submission would look like. I put these reams of paper there to kind of demonstrate what it would look like in the amount of paper. So on his first submission on February 20th, he has 717 packets. And if you have 7 pages per packet, this is what it would look like. And then it goes through, he turns in a total of 10 submissions. And then this is another way of looking at that. With that picture I just showed you, this is another graphic of the same thing, just a different illustration. And it shows here, the reason this is in blue, because I'm just showing that the submission sheet corresponds to this number 8 that was submitted on March 14th. And that'll kind of make more sense. If you haven't seen a previous update, this will make more sense as we go along. Let's go to the charges. Of the 6 of the 11 that are charged, these are the ones that are not employees of Gathering Inc. So they did not turn in any of the signatures that they turned in were not for Governor Cox. But I want you to understand here that I made this graph and I got this information from the indictments. So we know number one, how many packets they turned in. We know total number of signatures they turned in. We know how many are valid. And I added the percentages to this just to show you that, like Denton Williams, he turns in 4 packets, 99 signatures, but only 4 of them are valid. And the investigator saying that the other ones are fraudulent. But we get this level of detail from these particular signature gatherers. But now look what happens in contrast when we go over to the gathering ink employees. We don't get any detail. So all these red question marks that I put in these columns, this is information we're missing. But let me just go back. We get all that with these other signature gatherers. But and I'll tell you why this is happening. Why are the gathering ink employees, we don't get any information from the media or from their indictments. And there's a reason for that. And it has to do because these were the people that turned in signatures for Cox. So this is the same graphic as the previous one. The only difference is I added a new column, which is the Cox list. So on Governor Cox's signature list, I know that Rocco Huntsman turned in 9 packets. I know that Colton Drake turned in 5 packets and so on. But it appears that these people are not being charged for any of the signatures, maybe with one exception, but any of the signatures that they turned in that are fraudulent on the Cox list, they're not being held accountable for those. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But so let's start off with Joseph Wild, who turned in 6 packets into the Cox signature list. And when we read his indictment or we go to the media to see what they talk about in there, first of all, let me just point out that these 3 on the bottom, they're only being indicted based on their indictment for signatures that were turned in for Senator Ibsen. And the reason we know that is because when you read their indictment, they're only being charged for signature packets that were turned in to the Washington County Clerk. And those would be the Ibsen signature list. And so here you have, what I want to show you too is that in the indictment, it gives you the dates of when those packets were turned in. And so the ones for Ibsen were turned in between January 27th and March 10th. Well, here Wild has turned in submissions on March 14th for Cox. So we know that he's not getting charged for anything that he did on the Cox list. The other thing I want to point out is, like, Joseph Wild has a signature packet here with 230 signatures. That would mean that it's a minimum of 20-something pages in a signature packet, which is unusual, which is why I did a grammar request back in November for the cover sheets like this. And by the way, any cover sheet, and I think Cox ends up having like 5 of them that have these high numbers, anything above 50, 230, and 110. It's all from people that ended up being charged with turning in fraudulent signatures. So, and you can kind of see the interesting thing is here, like the staples makes sense that you see how this has 230 signatures in it, probably 20 pages. You're going to need extra staples. And this one has extra right here too. So it's weird that my understanding is the way the employer did it is that they gave them 5 pages. And then with the cover sheet and the back sheet, the verification sheet, that's 7. But somehow these guys are able to turn in more. I don't know if they did it or the clerk did it, but that remains to be seen. And so let's look at Joseph Wild. I just want to point out here that when he turns in a packet, and it has it's packet number 908, those numbers are assigned by the Davis County Clerk, and they number them as they come in. Spencer Cox ended up turning in a total of 911 packets. So you see this is 908 is the number for this particular packet. And this is what it looks like when it shows up on the list. And things should always match, that you have a total of 34 signatures over here that were turned in. And I can go to the Cox signature list and count 34 signatures or names of people, meaning that they were all recorded from this packet that was turned in. And you'll understand why I'm kind of being really basic about this. So let's go to Axel Burt, who, again, is only being charged for signatures that were turned in for Senator Ibsen. So I won't go into the same detail I went with Joseph's, but let me just point something out here. That here you have Alex Burt is another one who turns in 110 signatures instead of the customary 50. And I can go and look at the list and the Cox signature list and find names that are valid. And then when I compare it to the Wilson list, because that's the other candidate that Axel Burt turned in for, and those same signatures don't match. So on the not matching on Brad Wilson's list, but they match, they're considered match on the Cox list, which, by the way, this is what Natalie Clausen wanted to do with the Ibsen list. This is what started all this back in June, is that she said, well, if we get the Ibsen list and compare it, she was thinking that you're going to find this, that instead of Brad Wilson, you put the Ibsen list there, that you're going to find not matching ones on Brad Wilson's list, and you're going to find them matching on Spencer Cox's list. Well, it works here. And again, because I think that these clerks were determined to give Cox the advantage. So let's move on to Drake Colton. And again, he's somebody who's only being charged, from what I could tell, with fraudulent signatures on Ibsen's list, not on Cox's list. And again, he's turning in packets with 197 signatures and then like another packet with 107 signatures. And by the way, in the indictment, it specifically says that he's getting charged for packets that were turned in with only 5 pages of signatures per packet. So we know this is not, he's not getting charged for the fraudulent signatures on these. Same thing with him. I can go back and find Brad Wilson's list of signatures he turned in that are not valid, not matching on Brad Wilson's list, but those same signatures, which he, I guess, I don't know which ones he forged, but they're all of a sudden they're okay on the Cox list, but not on the Brad list, Wilson list. Let's move on to Rocco Huntsman. Now, Rocco Huntsman, we don't get any numbers really on him, but number one, we know that he probably doesn't get charged for anything that's on the Cox list, and because he gets paid the more money. So just look at Benson Angelo. He turned in a total of 2,000 signature, gets paid this amount of money. Well, Rocco got paid more than that, so we could probably surmise that Rocco turned in more signatures than Benson Angelo, but we can't account for a lot of those. I think, from looking at the candidate list that I have, there's over 1,000 of his signatures that are missing because they ended up, I don't know where. So let's look at his indictment that he has. And again, there's one in particular I want to focus in on. He has the same problems that I just talked about, but there's one issue that is an example of some of the things that I found, and I just don't list them all here because of time. But on the Cox list for packet number 366, I can see that there's 24 signatures listed on there, but when I did a grammar request and I get the cover sheet and the circular verification, it says that there's 50 signatures on there. That he turned in 50 signatures in the packet, but for some reason, only 24 of them are showing up on the Cox list, which is really bizarre. So I submit a grammar request and I say, I want to see the entire packet. And I don't tell them why, because grammar doesn't require you to tell them why you want it, but I want to see the entire packet, and they deny my request. As you likely notice, there is a handwritten number of 50 signatures on the cover sheet of the packet. Packet 366 was only partially verified by the Davis County Clerk's office because the required signature threshold of 28,000 was reached in the middle of verifying the packet. Only verified signatures appear in the packet report you receive. This is the reason for the perceived discrepancy between the handwritten number and the number in the report. So first of all, there's no perceived nothing. There is a discrepancy. And the problem with that is that, because again, this is an example, evidence of the fact that this particular packet was flagged and was pulled out of the verification process. And then when they get to the end, they decide, oh, he's short. And instead of going out and getting more signatures, number two, I guess, because number one is you should have recorded this. You should have put all 50 signatures in here in the first place when you got the packet and just declared which ones were not matching and which ones were, and you still do your investigation. But in this case, they were, for Cox, wanted to be sneaky about it and pull out packets, I guess, so that he could have a higher verification rate, which was ridiculous. But they end up putting this back in the process. And this is how we know this, because that is packet number 366. It had to be turned in on February 20th. And by the way, state law says that you have to verify these signatures within 14 days of receiving them. But no, they don't do that. They take it out from the process, and again, it's not, and you'll see what I mean here in a second. But let me do an editorial note here. That I do a grammar request because one of the ways I thought I could kind of figure out what's going on is that the law says that within 1 business day after verifying each signature in a candidate submission, the filing officer shall notify the candidate of the total number of valid signatures in the submission and whether the candidate has met the threshold qualification. So basically, let me just show you on this graph here. What that means is that when they turned in, they think they turned in 28,000 signatures the first time, there's a chance that they would have met the threshold. So within 1 business day of counting those signatures, they have to notify the candidate, where they're at in terms of valid signatures. That's how they know they need to keep turning in signatures, because they're not close to the threshold. So in this case, I said, well, let me see this notification that you're supposed to be giving them. And then it says, our office was notified by Davis County on March 18th that Cox campaign had reached the required signature threshold. Additionally, the status was updated to qualified for primary election on the LGO website. Candidates were notified at that time. So basically what they're saying is they have no record of following this law. They didn't notify anybody. Well, I guess it doesn't say it has to be in writing. So the only notification they did was through the website. They said that's how people were notified. So we don't have any record on what if you will, how many they were, as time went on, what was being verified in terms of numbers. Another grammar request I did, because it says in the law, if the filing officer rejects a submission in accordance with Section A5, the filing officer shall provide the candidate with a written explanation of the rejection. So if they rejected packets, or when they flagged packets and pulled them out of the verification system and did not record them in Vista, well, they would have recorded them, and this law says you record it by provide the candidate, and this says written explanation of the rejection. And then they tell me here in response, they don't have any records of this. Our office has not issued any notices of rejection for any of Spencer Cox's nomination petition submissions. We have also contacted Davis County, who received and performed the verification of all statewide nomination petitions and have confirmed that they did not issue any notices of rejection for the Spencer Cox nomination petition submissions. As a result, there are no records responsive to your request. So to me, that's illegal. This is how you keep track of the integrity of the process, and they purposefully did not follow it. So let me go back and And let's go back to these packet number 366. And what I want to show you is that at the end of the process, and this one in orange, the reason it's in orange is because these are the submissions. I think there was 20 of them that were turned in on March 15th. And this is where we get the end of the packets that are recorded in Cox's list, and then you start the unreviewed ones, if you will, the packets that are in here of signatures that they didn't count, because remember, they stop at the point that he meets the threshold. So again, this was turned in March 15th, and there was 20 packets turned in. And this is what remember, he had 911 packets. I just want to show you the second to the last one would be 910. It was 43 signatures, and this is what it looks like on the Cox list, and it matches. He turned in 43 signatures are in the packet, 43 signatures end up on the Cox list. And then for 911, which was the last packet that they counted, that once he met the threshold on March 15th, they end up stop the count. And the only ones they counted towards Governor Cox for the last packet on his list, 911, were the ones until they claim that he met the threshold. So you see the problem here is, how is a packet 366 that was turned in on February 20th being used, and you're going to stop in the middle for spare signatures because you're saying he met the threshold? The only way that's possible is because you ended up using that at the end because you had to resubmit it. And there's several like that I have that I can see they did that with, which is, in my opinion, ridiculous, and it's illegal to do that for various reasons. But that's what they did, that we even know of. Who knows what else they did? But I want to also show you that when I did a grammar request earlier this year, and I said, I want the cover sheet and the verification sheet of all the for the signatures that are spare signatures or considered spare signatures, they ended up, and here it shows here that they actually responded to that. I think I had to pay like $50 for them, and I ended up with 17 packets that represent the spare signatures. And so, in other words, if hopefully you see the problem here, they should have given me or notified me that these other packets, these flag packets that they're shuffling around, that some of them had spare signatures in them, but they didn't. And that's a violation of GRAMA. That you don't tell me, you lead me to believe that you're fulfilling the records request, and then you claim later, oh, there's some more spare signatures. So who knows where they're lying, but they're lying. And they got caught. So let me show you this here, that one of the things I did also is I file a grammar request. I said, now I want to see the signature packets, the packets themselves for the spare signatures. You gave me the cover sheet and the verification sheet, but now that's not matching. Number one, those cover sheets don't match the amount of signatures that 2 audits said were there, and now you don't have a list of them, and now I'm being told that the designation of whether they were valid or not is actually marked on the packet itself. So I want a copy. I want copies of those signature packets, and then they go through this thing. Oh, we don't have a report for it, but I wasn't asking for a report. Here's what they say, that in our office, as previously indicated, unverified petition signatures were not reviewed by Davis County Clerk office as part of the candidate nomination process, and thus not entered into VISTA. I know all that. For this reason, there's no report. I didn't ask for that. Here's what I asked for: the signature packets. But this is the kind of game they play with me, that I ask for something, they'll deny it and pretend I'm asking for something else. So I don't know, and again, I call it incompetence, camouflaging corruption. Because either way is not good. Either you got people that stupid working in the lieutenant governor's office that have some low reading comprehension issues, or they're covering. Either way, we're in trouble. that this is what we're dealing with. But it's a delay tactic, and I'm in no rush. So I think they have till next week to respond to my appeal. So let's move on to Benson Angulau. Now, what happens is he does not show up on the Cox list at all, but they're going to go ahead and give us a lot of detail about his what he turned in terms of, and again, remember, Rocco Huntsman had to have more signatures than Angulau, but they're not going to list those. But for Benson Angulau, they're going to go ahead and list. He's the only Gathering Inc. employee that they're going to list, and I would call him the proverbial scapegoat in this, because his name, because Cox, you can't associate Cox's name back to Angulau. Well, let's go ahead and give it all to Angulau. But look at the irony here. I can go find Benson Angulau. They misspelled his name. I can find him on the Brad Wilson list, and they put him on there. That whatever signatures he turned into Brad Wilson, I don't know if that's all of them, but they can list it as not matching. And if you're following this, I hope that I'm explaining this right or making it clear. This is what should be happening on the Cox list. When we got the Cox list, if these people were honest, and by the way, this is what they're hiding, is among a number of things. This is one of them, that they should have had this on the Cox list. That all you do is you put them in there when you got Benson's packets. You just document it because that's the law. But they didn't. They pull them out. But it's okay to go ahead and document not matching signatures in these packets that were turned in for Wilson for whatever reason. Again, let's go back to June 21st when Phil Lyman is questioning this, because he's a CPA and he's a smart man. He knows something's up. Today we know that he was right. But in the midst of all that, on that same day that article comes out, we have the Davis County Clerk, McKenzie, making an affirmation statement. He did several interviews at the time. He knows he's lying. And he says that petitions were date stamped. That's not true. They were not all date stamped. I just showed you some number of them that are not. In fact, the ones that have to do with the people that turned in fraudulent signatures or had this inflated number of signatures per packet, those are not date stamped. He says all petitions remain in the custody of the Davis County Clerk personnel throughout the verification process. That's a lie. And this is pretty important for our purposes here today. If a signature was valid, it was counted towards a candidate. If a signature was invalid, it was rejected, and a reason for the rejection was recorded. That's pretty important. Number one, that's the law. Number two, it would have been good if you followed that process. Number three, at the time that he made this affirming statement to the public to reassure us that everything was had integrity to it. Number four, by the way, in doing this, he's gaslighting Lyman. And it worked. At the time, he's making Lyman look like a fool for questioning everything. And he's telling us that Lyman's a liar when indeed it's the other way around, because he did not record everything. That's the law, but he didn't do it. Once completed, petitions were stored in the secure Davis County Election Center. That's not true, because you were shuffling back and forth. Packets only for Lieutenant Governor. So she was participating in the verification of her own signatures, which is, to me, illegal. Here's the other issue with Benson Angulau, that you recall that the first video in this series of the cover-up had to do with Burton, and I called him a liar, and I still stand by that. And when I did a grammar request, said, hey, I have witnesses that have told me that this is in July, the first week of July of 2024, they were interviewed by an investigator, Jordan, and that she gave them this business card with this case number on it. And I want a copy of that report. Now, what should have happened in DeGramma, they give me a letter saying, we're not giving you a copy. There's an ongoing investigation, and in DeGramma, the record's protected. I would have appealed it. But in this case, they said, we're not even doing an investigation. We don't have any records. And then that's the one where the records committee wouldn't even schedule an appeal, which was illegal. But it was all, they colluded with each other to cover this up. They were, and it's just ridiculous that they were so desperate to cover up the fact that an investigation was going on with Governor Cox's signatures. And again, it makes sense today why they were doing that, because he was short signatures. He didn't have the spare signatures. They squandered the next 28 days they had to go collect more signatures. So the last thing they wanted people to know is that there was an investigation going on for his shortfall. And it worked at the time. It got them through, up to the election time. So I think at the time too, they're thinking, well, if we can just get past this or get past this, everybody's going to go away. Guess what? We're here a year later and nobody's gone away. But and the longer we stay, the more we uncover that the very investigator that he claims wasn't investigating the Cox list, her name is all over these indictments. She is the one investigating the signature list, fraudulent signatures. But because the witnesses that were interviewed by her, she showed them the Cox signature list, and their signatures were on there that were forged. So let me show you this. In the indictment for Benson Angulau, the investigator, she says, I contacted many of the voters whose signatures appeared on the petitions circulated by the defendant, whose signatures did not match the signatures on file. And she has initials here of the people that she interviewed. The people that I talked to, their initials are here. So this case here that they're covering up and saying it had nothing to do with Cox and denied that he was even going on, has everything to do with Cox. At least that's what the witnesses told me, that the ones that gave me this business card, this has to do with Cox. Now I can trace it back that it has to do with Benson Angulau, who does not show up on the Cox list at all. So let's talk about this investigation real quick. That here you have, back in November, I had, this is an appeal that I did on a grammar request because they were denying me records on the basis, this is the Lieutenant Governor's office, that the Attorney General's office was doing an investigation. And I said, no. 3 months ago, in response to a records request appeal to the Utah Attorney General, I received the attached response from Daniel Burton, General Counsel, wherein he denies my appeal and refutes the protected classification invoked by I said, and it refutes this now protected classification that the Lieutenant Governor's now given me, because what I'm saying is you can't tell me that you're going to withhold records because an investigation is going on by the Attorney General when the Attorney General's already told me there is no investigation into the Cox list. And this guy Brody with the Lieutenant Governor's office says, let me provide a measure of clarification in relation to your request. It appears there may have simply been an issue of timing in relation to when you filed your grammar request with the Attorney General's office versus the packets in question were turned over to them. At the time of your request to the Attorney General's office, the packets had not yet been turned over for review. The packets in question are now in their possession. So you see what he's saying, and well, I'll just read this. Then I reply right away, same day, as I understand it, the Davis County Clerk completed the signature verification process of Cox signatures around March 15th. The letter from Burton stating they were not conducting an investigation is dated August 7th. What I understand you to say is that the Lieutenant Governor's office held on to questionable Cox signature package for at least 4 months before turning those over to the Attorney General's office. And then this idiot replies, but look how he replies, almost 2 weeks later, the records in question were turned over to the Attorney General's office in April of last year. Beyond that, our office cannot comment on ongoing investigations. Please direct any further to the Attorney General. Right. So I'm going to refer something to the Attorney General about an investigation that they already denied is going on, that this idiot Brody, Bailey, just told me, oh, no. the reason they said that is because they didn't have the package yet. And then when I questioned him again about it and say, look, dude, this is how stupid you sound. You're going to tell me that you guys held on to packets? Do you know what kind of chain of custody issue and these quote unquote criminal investigations that would cause if that really happened? And then he has to come clean on it because he realizes how stupid he sounds. But this is the level of stupidity that we're dealing with. Again, it's that mantra, incompetence camouflaging corruption. So in reality, I get through a grammar request, I have an email between the Davis County Clerk and Cali, given the ongoing investigation regarding forgeries and circulator ID fraud, that March 18th, 2 days after Cox's signatures were verified, the investigation was going on. So even when I tell Brody how stupid he sounds, he still can't get it right. Oh, well, we turned him over in April. That's not true. These guys were already doing an investigation. It's unlikely they were doing an investigation without having the packets. So that's just to show you, again, the only reason I bring that up is that just to show you the pattern of deception that they keep weaving that really doesn't get them anywhere. It just makes them look, more foolish than they did the first time around. So let's talk about in the audit. It says that during the review of signatures in candidate petition packets, we were unable to locate certain packets because they had been separated and set aside for further review by election officials at the Lieutenant Governor's office. Understand, these are not at the Attorney General's office because, by the way, in the audit, he says he looked at all those, but now we have packets missing that I guess that when they were initially missing, the Auditor General just thought, well, they were over at the AG's office. And then when they go look at those, they realize, oh, they're not there. So he says, where are these? And he says they eventually find them. So then I do a grammar request, said, hey, I want to see these records that were hanging out at your office, because you guys are shuffling packets around and not even, there's no accountability for them, no chain of custody, no log of where they're going, or even if they're the original ones that were, part of the verification process, I want to see them. And they say they're protected and therefore not subject to release. They're not going to give them to me. All right. So let's go back to Benson Angulau. We're told that 84 of the signatures, 3.7% of the signatures that he turned in, they're saying are valid signatures. So if they're valid, the only way they know they're valid is because they entered them into the VISTA system. And I said, I want the cover sheets for them for these valid signatures because, if they're valid, you counted them. The signature packets you have requested are part of an ongoing investigation and therefore classified as protected. So, so I appeal it. And I say, by way of clarification, my records request is for the cover sheet and verification sheet of the circulator Benson Angulau's 84 signatures, not the packets. So again, this is their delay tactic. This is their slimy way of covering up for all this corruption and this collusion that's been going on. And you know what, to me, the tragedy is that these are young people. This is a new person over here. I forget her name that's responding to the grammar request. And then you have Brody, who's, I don't know how old he is, but he's way younger than I am, but he's learning early on to be a little liar and to be part of this corruption. And to me, that's a bigger tragedy. It's one thing to say that, Lieutenant Governor and Governor are cheaters, but they're training the next generation how to cheat and how to cover and how to delay. And to me, that's among many other tragedies, that's another one. So one of the things that occurs to me, having a law enforcement background, is that all this stupidity that they're doing and trying to cover themselves, I think in these criminal cases, there's going to be a chain of custody issue going on. For example, with Benson Angulau, is that, that hopefully his attorney, if anybody knows Benson Angulau, get this video to him so he can get it to his attorney. And they need to look at this, because I think that if he's getting charged for anything that has to do with Governor Cox's list, then through discovery, he should get all that information. And they should look at that information. I recognize that his attorney is not worried about the things we're worried about transparency and chain of custody with the election process, but he should be worried about the charges that have been leveled against his client. And he needs to make sure that you're dealing with cheaters in the Attorney General's office and in the Lieutenant Governor's office and in the Davis County Clerk's office, and they're looking for a scapegoat, and they found one. And so if I was the attorney for Benson Angulau, I would make sure that those charges are accurate and that there's accounting for them, because you got a chain of custody issue. Number one, the 48 packets that he turned in, was that really what he turned in? Number two, they got shuffled around. Did anybody mess around with those? You have the candidate who you just saw at the beginning of this presentation call everybody cheaters. And by the way, we're not given records because they say that's going to interfere with the prosecution, but it's okay for her to go ahead and declare people guilty. And normally, you have a government official say, well, I can't comment on that because there's an ongoing investigation, but not her, because she is desperate to throw the blame on somebody else. In fact, remember, she said she's the victim here, and that these greedy gatherers are the ones that are the problem. So hopefully his attorney, will represent him and make sure that these cheaters, the real cheaters, didn't, trump up charges on him, on his client. And and maybe there's a chance that we find out more information, that through discovery of the criminal case, we actually get to the bottom of things that we can't through grandma. So, let me just close here that, I don't need to read this. This is kind of, where we're at. And I do want to close with this, that we have in these flag signatures that these conflict of interest concerns bring much clarity to the cover-up actions of the Lieutenant Governor. More specifically, the desperate attempts to conceal or delay the release of all election records of the signature verification process. When we allow a candidate to participate in the verification process to benefit their campaign, it erodes public trust in the integrity of the Utah electoral system.